just keep hammering away at this series slowly but surely. I'm going to get through all 32 teams here in the month of June. This video here, though, is about this, or this, this video is to talk about the 5 greatest Baltimore slash Indianapolis Colts players of all time. And this is an organization that's had a history, a good history, a troubled history at times, a disturbing history at times in terms of what happened when they moved from Baltimore to Indianapolis and the way that the old man Irsay pulled it off and did it. So nonetheless, this is an organization with some championship history in its past and some championship and consistent history of success in its more recent history, if you will. And this was an interesting list to do because I actually thought there were going to be more Colts players that I was going to have to leave off than I ultimately did. There have been some great players in Baltimore Colts and Indianapolis Colts history. There's no question about it. But I thought this list was going to be harder to do, frankly, than it actually ended up being. Now, I will go through first some of the guys, the honorable mentions. Several of these guys are actually in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. A couple of them may end up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame someday. I look at guys like Art Donovan and Lenny Moore and John Mackey and Raymond Berry, guys that were on those Colts teams of the 50s and 60s that were among one of the toast of the league franchises, if you will, one of the premier model organizations of the NFL. Some other good players in their history, guys like Chris Hinton, guys like Dwight Freeney, guys like Edgar and James. Those are guys that stand out to me. Maybe a guy like a Mike Curtis for some of you older Colts fans, you'll know who I'm talking about. But ultimately, this list to me was getting down to the nitty gritty, the 5 greatest Baltimore slash Indianapolis Colts players of all time. And ultimately, I was able to do that, and I feel pretty good about my list. The only position that I had trouble with was number 5. I thought 4-3-2-1 was pretty easy for me to do, but number 5 was a little bit tough, and I ultimately decided on Marvin Harrison. He was the 19th overall pick out of Syracuse in the 1996 NFL Draft. During his 13 seasons in Indianapolis, in my opinion, he became one of the truly great all-time NFL wide receivers that, frankly, because of his lack of a prima donna attitude, a lack of his me-first approach in today's media world and climate, he didn't always get the respect or the attention that he deserved. Maybe that's in part two because all the greatness was always associated with the quarterback throwing him the ball. But Marvin Harrison, beyond question, is one of the great route runners in NFL history, one of the surest handed receivers in NFL history, one of the great professionals at the wide receiver position in NFL history, one of the hardest workers in the history of the position in all of the NFL's history. You're talking about a guy that was an 8-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time first team All Pro, a 2-time league leader in receptions and receiving yards. He was a part of that 2006 Indianapolis Colts Super Bowl championship team. He had 8 straight seasons where he went over 1,000 yards receiving. 3 of those seasons where he went over 1,500 yards receiving, a member of the 2000s NFL All-Decade team. Now, where a lot of people think of those Colts of the 2000s and they always think about the quarterback, to me, right along with that quarterback, I always think about that steady hand, that reliable go-to target that could do everything. And that to me was Marvin Harrison. And that's ultimately why I put him on the list over maybe a John Mackey or a Raymond Berry. It was close. I could have went with either one of those two guys. But I thought at the end of the day that Marvin Harrison was greater for a longer period of time and was more dominant than a John Mackey or a Raymond Berry was, even though some fans are surely going to disagree with me when it comes to John Mackey. Number 4, I go to the old Baltimore Colts teams of the 50s and 60s, and I go to one of the greatest offensive linemen in the history of the National Football League, and that is Jim Parker, the 8th overall selection out of Ohio State in the 1957 NFL Draft. Jim Parker, during his time, was viewed as the premier left tackle of his era, who actually moved inside to left guard to become arguably the greatest left guard of his era and one of the great left guards of all time. I mean, he's an incredible player. During his 11 seasons in Baltimore, an 8-time Pro Bowler, an 8-time first team All Pro, unanimously viewed at his time and up until maybe Anthony Munoz as the greatest left tackle in terms of pass protection in the history of the National Football League. He was a part of two NFL championship teams for the Colts in 58 and 59. He was a member of the 1950s NFL All-Decade Team. He was a member of the NFL's 50th and 75th anniversary teams. He was also one of those rare players that was able to be a Pro Bowler and an All-Pro at multiple positions by earning those honors both while playing left tackle early in his career and then later on when he moved to left guard. One of the truly great offensive linemen of all time and definitely belongs on the Colts' top five, and some may argue that he goes even higher. But then we get to number three, and Marchetti, Gino the Giant Marchetti, if you will. This was a mountain of a man for his time and was the premier defensive end, many will argue, in the first 40 to 50 years of the NFL. He was a 14th overall selection out of San Francisco in the 1953 NFL Draft. Played 14 seasons for the Baltimore Colts. In that time, he was an 11-time Pro Bowler, a 7-time first-team All-Pro. One of the things that is challenging when you go back and evaluate these great players is in the case of pass rushers like Gino Marchetti, they didn't keep official sack totals at that time. So it's hard to quantify and measure just how truly great they were. But a Gino Marchetti would surely still to this day, if they kept the statistic at that time, be one of the league leaders or all-time leaders, if not the all-time leader in quarterback sacks. Again, an 11-time Pro Bowler, a 7-time first-team All-Pro in his 14 years in Baltimore, a member of the 1950s NFL All-Decade Team, a 2-time NFL champion, part of those great teams of 58 and 59, including that 58 team that played in the greatest game ever. That championship game between the Colts and the Giants that went to sudden death overtime that was won by Alan Amici's dive over the goal line. He was a member of the NFL's 50th and 75th anniversary teams, just like his teammate Jim Parker was. Again, Gino Marchetti to this day, similar to a Jim Parker, is viewed as one of the top 3 or 5 players of all time at his position. And that alone, you could throw some of the statistics out, let you know just how truly great a player is. That almost 50 years after he retired, he's still viewed as maybe one of the 5 best or 3 best to ever play the position. That's saying something. But then we get down to number 1 and number 2. And obviously, they're going to both be quarterbacks. And I think most all Colts fans and probably NFL fans in the know would agree that these two guys belong at 1 and 2. The question is ultimately, who do you put 1 and who do you put 2? Maybe this is a matter of personal preference. This is a matter of preferring the present day and valuing the increase of statistics and the increase of the proliferation of the passing game. Or do you value the past? Do you value the history and nostalgia of the game? Do you value the quarterback that became the definition and the model for all future quarterbacks in a traditional sense to follow and to live up to? That's the ultimate question. At number 2 on my list, I put Peyton Manning, the number 1 overall selection out of Tennessee in the 1998 NFL Draft. Imagine how differently the Colts franchise's fortunes would have been if they would have taken Ryan Leaf with that number 1 overall selection. Just think about that for a second. And for all the grief I give Peyton Manning and all the things I say about him, that I stand by all of them, and I always will because I feel most of them are true. They're not even just opinions, they are outright facts. The fact of the matter is that Peyton Manning came into an organization that, other than those cardiac Colts under Harbaugh in 95, that came this close to actually beating the Steelers in the AFC Championship game and making it to the Super Bowl. This is a Colts franchise that had had a lot of bad times through the 80s and through the 90s, and this was a franchise in desperate need of somebody to come in and change their fortunes, somebody to come in and be that guy. And no question about it in my mind, Peyton Manning was every bit of that you could possibly hope for and so much more. He spent 14 total seasons with the Indianapolis Colts, 13 of them where he actually played every single game, 208 consecutive starts at the quarterback position to start his career. A phenomenal track record, a phenomenal accomplishment that only one quarterback has ever been able to match, and that, of course, is Brett Favre. And he went far beyond that, which speaks to just how incredible Brett Favre's record was. But Peyton Manning playing over 200 consecutive games, not even factoring in all of the playoff games over the years that I think you have to throw in there too. Just a tremendous accomplishment at such a difficult position, frankly, to stay healthy at. He was able to do that. 11-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time first team All-Pro during his 14 seasons in Indianapolis, a 2-time AFC champion, a 1-time Super Bowl champion, a 4-time NFL Most Valuable Player while with the Indianapolis Colts, a member of the 2000s NFL All-Decade Team. His career starting record as a starting quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts between the time frame of 1998 to 2010 in particular, when he actually played those 13 seasons, was 141 in 67. Wow. That's over a 65% winning percentage. When you look at the fact that they had 10 seasons out of those 13 years where he was the starter that played, 10 of those seasons, if not 11 of those seasons, if I recall correctly, they won at least 10 games. They made the playoffs 10 times. An incredible track record, an incredible amount of consistent success enjoyed under Peyton Manning. No question about it. Peyton Manning was a game changer. Peyton Manning was a franchise changer. When you talk about truly elite franchise quarterbacks that become the organization and become the franchise, Peyton Manning clearly fits into that mold. And a lot of people, I'm sure, are going to blast away in the comments that they feel he is the greatest Colt of all time. And if you do that, that's fine. Like I said, this is more about perspective. There's a lot of argument to be made. But I think at the end of the day, the greatest Colt of all the Colts in the 60-plus year history of that franchise and organization has to be Johnny Unitas. To me, you're looking at a Johnny Unitas that was originally drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers and cut because the coach at the time, Walt Kisling, felt that Unitas, of all things, lacked the intelligence and football IQ and aptitude to be able to play quarterback in the National Football League. He goes back home, he works an odd job, he plays semi-pro football, and then he gets a shot with the Baltimore Colts. And the NFL was changed forever. Johnny Unitas was changed forever. The Baltimore Colts and the franchise was changed forever. During his 17 seasons as the man for the Baltimore Colts, he was a 10-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time first-team All-Pro. He was clearly the preeminent quarterback of his era, no question about it. Whereas some people will dispute, was Peyton Manning really the preeminent quarterback of his time statistically and with everything else? Do you value Brady's winning more? Has Breeze had some better statistical seasons? There was no question that Johnny Unitas was the best statistical quarterback of his time. There is no question that Johnny Unitas was the best leader of his time, the smartest quarterback of his time, and the most capable quarterback in the clutch of his time. All of those things point to him and his time being the greatest of that time. He was a 3-time NFL Most Valuable Player, 3-time NFL champion, a member of the Super Bowl V championship Colts team, a 4-time league leader in passing yards and passing touchdowns, a member of both the NFL's 50th and 75th anniversary teams, a member of the NFL's 1960s All-Decade team. When you look at Johnny Unitas, it goes beyond that, though. It's about what he was and who he was and what he represented. So many quarterbacks for so many generations to come viewed Johnny Unitas as the gold standard. They viewed Johnny Unitas as the model to follow. They viewed Johnny Unitas as the representation of greatness, of true greatness of NFL quarterbacks. The man that is often credited with the creation of the 2-minute drill, among so many other things. He was known for his over-the-top delivery, his flat-top haircut, his freaking high-top shoes. There's just so many things. Johnny Unitas, to me, when I think of the Colts franchise, and I know they've been in Indianapolis for over 30 years, so a lot of people are going to look at that as Peyton Manning's organization. Maybe someday they will look at it as Andrew Luck's organization. But to me, from a football historian standpoint, the Colts will always be Johnny Unitas' organization. And with his championship accomplishments, being more of a champion, in my opinion, than Peyton Manning was, with the same kind of consistent excellence throughout his career, and the dominance against his competition at his time, and what he came to represent, I think beyond question that Johnny Unitas is the greatest player in the history of the Baltimore/Indianapolis Colts franchise. Let me know what you think down below. Next up, I think we get to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Whoopee!